Amanda, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Do you want to start by giving us a little bit of information about your background and where you are at the moment?
Sure. So I've worked within sort of the startup world, well, mainly startup and corporate for the last 20 years, both here in the US. So I had 8 years in the US, which was when I went over there with a startup and then had my own business that was working with startups and trying to help them launch into the US. And then when I came back, I pitched the idea of HGV to KPMG and we got funding to develop it here.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. What's the biggest difference between Australian startup scene and the US? Obviously, there's a lot of differences, but what are the main ones that stand out from your perspective?
I know this sounds a bit corny, but I think the hustle, it's just a different level. It's constant actually and different here. The energy is different here. And I think that whole getting out and meeting people, asking people for help, all of that sort of thing just seems to happen on steroids there. Here it's definitely just feels as though it moves a little slower, I think.
Yeah. And in terms of the US scene, where are the biggest areas that you're helping companies get to?
Depends very much what type of startup they are and where they want to go. I still think that majority of startups, regardless of that, want to go to Silicon Valley and they want to experience it. And I still think that's worth it. I think, I was talking to someone the other day that runs trade missions and actually it was might have been Michael Batko from StartMate. And
Yeah.
he was talking about that. He said he's still going to take a team over to San Francisco. And I said, is that the only place? And I think they're doing it so people can experience that hustle and can experience what it's actually like to be in that environment. But I think there's lots of other places like Colorado's big. A number of companies we're working with moved to Colorado, Dallas, Atlanta. I had one this morning that's moving there. So
Yeah.
I think New York, it depends if you're a fintech, you might want to do New York. LA for B2C, there's a lot of B2C type companies that might go there. So it depends on what you're actually trying to do when you're there and where your customers are, where your investors are, I think. But we're up throughout the US. So as I said, I still think a lot of Australians still want to go to San Francisco.
Yeah. How does the process work when a company comes to you, or how does it from start to sort of finish?
We don't do any of the delivery work. So none of us are accountants, but it's a group of us dedicated to working with startups. And our role is to work with them on where they see the challenges, to help them prioritize some of those challenges sometimes, and then connect them in with the expertise within KPMG. So it's a bit like a concierge service, which is designed to help the founder save time and money. We negotiate the pricing and oversee the delivery of the work as well. It
Yeah.
also means that more often than not, the founder will buy a number of services across maybe tax, R&D, outsource CFO,
Yeah.
strategy. So I think that's saving them a lot of time and that they're going into a vetted network of people that have got experience with startups. So that's sort of the benefit and that's how we operate.
And when did this part of KPMG start?
7 years ago, I came back from the US and started talking to KPMG. I was running some external programs for them as a consultant, and we started to talk about what would it look like for a big four to start working with more startups. And at that stage, well, even now, I mean, the big four is they're working at the big end of town predominantly, and then they've got the mid market. And this was a sector that they wanted to focus on, didn't really know how to enter. And so we sort of started talking about this idea, and then they gave me funding. So we were an investment for the firm. They gave us funding to set this business up and really focus on that sector.
Is there investments made in businesses, or is it's just helping them through the process?
Just helping them, like it's basically a straight fee for service model. And we don't take equity. My personal view is that we shouldn't be. If we own, for example, more than 10% of a company, they are subject to our independence rules, which means they can't sell or work with any of our audit clients and things like that.
Yeah.
So it can be problematic for them. So for us, it's just, getting in fee for service, but we have very good networks in terms of investors and things like that, so we can connect them.
And in terms of startup, what do you guys define a startup as in terms of size and scale and that sort of thing?
Yeah, everyone's always surprised. We actually start. I really love early stage, so we start very early. So that's pre-Series A. So
Yeah.
they've probably raised some angel money. They've then gone and raised anything from 500K up. But even in saying that, we've got quite a few bootstrapped companies we're working with as well that are already revenue generating. But they come in and really then it's about the foundation. So it's like how are you structured from a tax perspective, a business perspective, R&D. Are you getting all of the incentives that you can get? And then really the biggest offering for us is that outsourced finance piece. So we start doing the bookkeeping, that'll then sort of go into compliance and reporting. And then we sit over the top of that. We put an outsourced CFO, and that's really a person who will sit and talk with the founder and the board. And he's really starting to help them sort of understand the finances from a forward-looking perspectives.
And from your perspective, when did you get into that space?
When I came out of uni, I went into a business which was actually the ex-Imagineering. I don't know if you remember Jody Rich. Yeah, Jody
Oh,
Rich.
yeah. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. He had a company called Imagineering that went broke. They then started a new company called Tech Pacific, which was a distribution business for technology products. But the business itself went like the growth was off the chart. And I was in the first sort of 15 that started there. And I think from that I started to know the growth piece I loved and that was fast and I sort of
Yeah.
absolutely loved that. And then that sort of got me thinking what else was out there that was fast, and then startups sort of started and I just wanted to be in startups. So I really sort of got into the space that way. And then it just kept going. I just kept wanting to be in startups and around founders. And then when I was in the US, I went over with a startup, but then I ended up starting, as I said, a business where we supported founders pretty in a similar way as we're doing now. And I love that because I liked working with a lot of founders. So I don't know now if I could go back into one because it's a lot of fun working with, like, we've got 300 of them. We've worked just 300 plus actually over the last 5 years. We've got
Right.
100 in our portfolio that we're working with quite closely, and it's great.
Yeah, okay. And you find that when you first started, your views have changed in terms of where you see the tech space going, given what you've now seen with over 300 different companies versus when you started?
Yeah, I had a startup in 2000s at start, around that time. And I'm embarrassed to say now that I was, founder of it. Start like it's chalk and cheese. I mean, you can't compare. We didn't have any of the technology that people are using now to run the business. It's more how you run the business. It just wasn't as sophisticated and it doesn't feel comparable to what they have to do now. And also the growth that we've seen. And I remember this in the US. I remember just thinking at one point, we're now really starting to see scale, which I don't think we'd seen as much before. And technology was enabling businesses to do that. And it was like I actually really remember thinking, wow, this is starting to change. And when we started to see that scale, and when I went there in 2007, so it was around that time for me, that's when venture capital really started to take off. And obviously those sorts of business require a lot of capital, especially if they're going after customers and acquiring customers in that way. It's changed enormously, I would say. I think the founders of today have a lot of challenges that we didn't have. And that comes from that growth piece. I mean, we deal with a lot of first time founders, and some of those companies, once they start to grow and scale, and they can do quite early, you've got fairly inexperienced founders raising quite a lot of capital, running a lot of people. That's hard. It's a lot of
Yeah.
challenges in that.
And from your perspective, what do you bring to the table with your experience and where you've been on your journey that really helps the founders when they come in to see you for the first time?
Empathy, I think, is
Yeah.
one. I actually think it sounded like a dumb thing to say, but it's actually really important. And it's one thing we had to sort of, I find the right people in KPMG to work with founders as well, because it's pretty easy when you haven't done it to sort of go, why haven't you done your finances? Why haven't you got that in place? And I think, to sort of sit down with people, really listen to the founders and actually start to hear. What we find is actually that a lot of the time, what they think the challenge is actually not the actual thing they need to be dealing with at that time. It's like that
Right.
referred pain type
Yeah,
thing.
yeah,
You're like, my
yeah.
shoulder really hurts, but it's actually something else. And it is quite often listening to them over a number of sessions to get a sense of what they actually need to deal with. And again, if you're a first time founder, the problem you see is what you're trying to fix immediately. And often it's just helping rejig that priority, look at that, work out what they need to do and also what they don't need to do now, which is a big thing as well. Often they'll think they need to do certain types of governance or things and it's just not needed until they're sort of later stage. So
Yeah.
I think the experience helps with that for sure.
What's the biggest mistake you see founders making?
Focusing too much on things they shouldn't and not on where they should. And what I mean by that is non-financial founders trying to do all the finances and everything themselves, where I'm a big believer in founder-led sales. And so it's sort of like, if you've got the choice of doing that, you should absolutely be out doing the sales, outsource that sort of stuff that you don't need to do. I think sometimes the control piece of it, when you see founders trying to do absolutely everything, and it's like, you just see they're never going to be able to scale, it won't be able to grow. The people
Yeah.
under them get really unhappy because they're not making decisions, and we see that quite often, actually.
So what sort of stuff should they get in place? Like you're talking about the outsource, the bookkeeping, the financial stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what they should do is actually look at what they're really good at. Look at what you're good at, overlay that with where you should be spending your time,
Yeah.
and the rest of it, if you can, is start to outsource it for sure. And it's in the finance, R&D. You can outsource anything really. And actually, one of the things we're seeing is the sort of an increase in, a lot of people don't like the name, but it's sort of the fractional services. And in the US, fractional services are huge. I mean, most startups will use some sort of fractional service, and that means instead of, for example, let's say I'm a Series A startup and I'm really growing. I wanted to design my marketing strategy, but I can't afford to go and hire a very big VP of marketing. Just having access to someone who's done that for 3 months or so, who can set up the strategy to help you understand who you need to hire, those sorts
Yeah.
of things for certain periods of time, that's a great way to do it. And fortunately, now there's a lot more access to those sorts of services and people in Australia.
Okay. What type of attributes do you see across the board where the founders that are successful have? And if you're seeing 300 odd companies come through, there must be things where some have it, some don't. And obviously that you can't account for grit and things like that
Mm.
until you see it. But what are the attributes that really stand out early on where you can sort of see that these guys are going to go far?
Yeah, there's a certain clarity that some founders have with when they can, how they communicate and how they can share their vision. I notice a lot actually in the way that people can actually describe to you what they're doing, and they can talk about the impact and they can articulate the value of what they're doing. And
Yeah.
I think that's super important. I mean, I can say all the normal things like resilience and everything, but I also think the ability not to get overwhelmed and stop, because there's so much to do. Like the founders that can work through the steps that they need to, because you do see people in overwhelm a lot. And it's sort of like the ones that can work out just one foot in front of the other. How do we just keep doing that and keep going? I also think being a bit of a generalist helps early
Yeah.
on as well, in that, the understanding. Like, I always thought I was lucky because I came from marketing and sales background. So you sort of got that. And ops I liked. So I could do the ops piece. Finance I was never going to be able to do. So I outsourced that. But
Yeah.
I think those sorts of things help. And also the other thing is energy. You've got to keep going. Like, you're not
Yeah.
working 9 to 5. And so I'm not saying people have to be like up and extrovert, but there's a certain energy that you have to keep going every day,
Yeah.
7 days, and keep doing what you're doing. And I think without that, it's pretty hard.
In terms of that, dealing with overwhelm and dealing with all the pressures that come with that, is there a level of compartmentalization that they automatically do or they learn to do? Or you're talking before about they methodically go through those sort of
Mm.
steps. Are they just sort of routine based? What are
I don't
the best
know.
founders do?
It's so like the profile of a founder, I think, is so varied. And also you've got founders who are so technical,
Yeah.
and over 60% of our portfolio is in climate tech or deep tech. So they're
Yeah.
highly scientific founders. It used to be 10 years ago that, we'll told the story of the founder who's an 18-year-old and he's super bright and done in a garage and all that sort of stuff. It's just not the way it is anymore. I mean, people,
Yeah.
and you look at the average age of founders. I mean, average now is up to 40. It's 40 plus. So we're in a different, more sophisticated world of startups, I think, that is very varied. So it's hard to sort of pick out any traits or anything of.
And does that go for founders generally, but does that also go for the most successful founders? Does it hold true when you look at, so you've got a sample of 300. If you go to the top 5 or 10% that come out the other end, if you like, are
Mm.
the variance in traits,
Well,
does
I
that
think
hold
probably,
up when you get to
yeah.
the pointy end of that side?
Look, I think it's a bit like going, are all athletes that win the same? And I'm sure they have to, of course, share some traits, the discipline, the one-mindedness, the vision, the ability to manage enormous amount of stakeholders. You think of someone like, Melanie from Canva, and you're like, how many people would she managing internal, big US investor, all of that? You've got to be able to manage all of it. So then the reason I just love being in this space is they're just really extraordinary people. I'm sure the people that deal with athletes or work with them are a bit the same. You sort of get
Yeah.
hooked on it because they're not like at that level, they're not normal
Mm.
because it's so operating at I just think a very different level than the majority of us.
No, that's probably quite true. What about the deficiencies, if you like, then the things that they're not naturally good at? Is there common ground there?
Yeah, in the technical space, we see struggling with the management of people, building culture.
Yeah.
Those are very foreign concepts, I think, to a lot of them. I also think in that space, we see people get very, very wedded to their product, what their, the technology they have. And they've just got
Yeah.
to realize there's no point when I meet with founders, I might meet with, let's say, 5 a day or whatever, there's no point sitting for an hour with me telling me about your technology. There's just no point. We're here to help you with the business. And
Yeah.
yet it's really hard. You can explain that till the cows come home. They just don't hear you. And I sit there and go, how are you going to go in front of investors? Where
Yeah.
investors to go into that much detail, it's just, they don't sort of, there's a bit of pro coaching around that. I think they just go sidetracked on that. It's where they're really comfortable. It's where they want to play. And really,
Yeah.
that's for a different type of meeting, certainly. I mean,
Yeah, that's
and
nice.
actually the worst thing is going to startup events, which we do a lot. Every time we go, you'll get bailed up by a founder who'll just want to talk technical. And I feel like I'm not technical. It's not going to make any difference to me. I don't know enough for it to matter. And that's hard because then the one mindedness is the thing that probably makes them really good as founders. But yeah, I don't know. I think that comes down to being able to talk to various stakeholders and understanding what people are actually interested in and what's valuable to them.
What's the most important part of the startup process to get right from the start?
Product market fit.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got to find someone who's going to buy it and pay for it. You've got to find your target. And I think that's the sort of goal at the beginning. You come up with the idea, you think that you've found an opening, you've got something that people want. You go out there and you build it, and then you've got to go and find not only who is going to buy it that it's who's going to buy it that you don't know. How big's that market? That's the piece. If you don't get that, you don't have a business.
Are there any companies or founders that you've met along the way where you've just looked at it and gone like, wow, these guys just have it. They've got it. They've nailed it.
Yep. Yeah. And again, am I the right person to make that call? Maybe not, but you sometimes meet them and you just go, as I said before, the clarity, the way they talk about it, the way they understand the metrics, the way they understand the levers they can pull in the business. We come away as a team and sometimes we're like, oh my God, like they're just next level. And you do here, sometimes we see it. It's not all the time, but you definitely, I feel like you definitely know it when you see it.
How has the Australian tech and VC landscape changed in the last sort of 10 years? What do you see now as the biggest strength of the
Numbers,
community? Yeah,
numbers.
just in terms of
I
scale
mean,
and volume?
yeah, I mean, 10 years ago, so like 2010 or 11, that's when StartMate started. We had Angel Cube, it's not around anymore in Melbourne. That was sort of, there was that, and then Blackbird, and then it sort of started to build up from there. But there wasn't anything. When I had my startup and I went to raise money, I just literally knocked on people's doors. Again, it's just completely different. So I say now we look at the number of accelerators we've got, you look at the number of VCs, you look at the number of high net worth, family offices all investing, the number of startups that we've got, we hope that that keeps increasing. It's just got to a point where this sort of scale. And the other thing that's really important is we've got people that have done it before or coming
Yeah.
back into the ecosystem. And I think that's the piece that we need. It'll
Yeah.
help.
That's probably what was missing 10 years ago in many respects, right?
Yeah.
Like now that you're getting various companies raise big chunks of money and exits, it
Yeah.
then becomes a self
It does. Remember like
sustaining
the
type.
PayPal mafia, that they
Yeah,
talked about
100%.
and you see it
Yep,
here. And we've got a couple we're working with the founders are Atlassian and things like
yep,
that. We'll see it with Canva if that keeps going and people can get some money out of it and then start companies. And I think that's going to be the next sort of phase, which is I think that will be really exciting.
yeah. Is the ecosystem growing as quickly and as well as it should? And I
I don't
think
know.
about the nature of investors, and I also think of the way government incentivizes and doesn't sometimes incentivize.
Yeah.
What else could be done?
Well, I mean, I was pretty vocal on the sort of proposed changes to the sophisticated investor policy
Yep,
I just can't get my head around why one would want to change that to make less people be able to invest. So I think we could definitely do better on that. I think there's always things that more the government could do in terms of where some of this money's going and some of the government programs that are being launched. And it's not, there's no clarity around what's happening with those. And I think that's very frustrating for everyone. But I don't know. I don't know how it grows as it should. I think it's growing. I mean, I think there's the big problem with the funding that's going to females is a big problem, a big challenge being talked about. I don't know if you saw the latest report that came out last week at the State of Australian startup funding. And again, it's just highlighted that the abysmal amount of funding that's going to females. And so there's things like that need to be addressed to get the ecosystem working as it should. But could there be always more things? Yes, there could always be more things that everyone could do. But I think we've got great quality VCs and, I'd like to see more funds going into early stage companies and things like that. But again, it's starting.
yep.
So if we keep continuing this way, it'll be good. It'll be great.
How does the Australian ecosystem compare to other countries like the US and others when it comes to funding female founders?
Well, it's a problem, I think, everywhere, to be honest. I
Right.
mean, what I heard when I read the report was that we're quite low still on the amount that is going. I think what percentage we are is still way lower than what it should be. So obviously the issues in the US, it's still the same. So we've got this really big problem and that's, and no one seems to be able to, no one's been able to flip it and change it on its head. And we've got now a lot of sort of early stage funds, especially that are really focused on female founders and making sure they're getting
Yeah.
funding. So that will help. But again, is it enough? No. Do I know the solution? No, I don't,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
What was the best advice you were ever given when you were a founder?
Always be all in. I had a very good mentor at the time, and he was like, because obviously it's a very up and down journey. And one minute you think you're on the biggest, you're going to be Canva, and the next minute you think, I don't even know I'm doing this. And I think his view was just whatever you do, just be all in on it. And it doesn't mean kill yourself and work 24/7. It just get rid of that side and just go, like get
Yeah,
in, go for it. And I think I found that really helpful because it's don't give in to the fear of it. Just keep going, one foot in front of each other and all in. And this is the thing that you're doing. And that's been helpful, I think, because I think at the beginning I was trying to do a job and do that. Like it's that sort of, so that to me resonated with me, but I think that's probably a personality thing as well.
would that be the advice you would give to new founders, or would there be something else you'd tell them if you could only give them one piece of advice?
Yeah, I mean, look, we do with it, as I said, we do deal with a lot of early stage founders. And I don't think you can say these days, I mean, money is tight. It's, hard
Mm,
to say to someone, just leave your job flippantly and go and do all this. And, because the funding is hard to get. But the one-minded focus on what you're doing, I don't know how you do a startup without it, to be honest.
yeah.
You can't, it's not a part-time gig.
Yeah, that's one of those things, right? And otherwise, you're trying to juggle multiple things. You're trying to do things by halves. Sometimes it's the fear of what might happen if you fail that is created by going all in. That
Yeah.
gives you the impetus to succeed.
It's like putting it all on the line. And also, if it is going to fail, it'll fail faster. So
Yeah,
I don't know. I think sometimes just having a business, which again, we talked to some founders that have got it on the side, and I understand the personal reasons for doing that, but I don't know whether you can actually see if it is winning or losing. It's just there on the side, and
yeah,
unless
yeah,
you're
yeah,
really focused. But again, I say that with the understanding that it's not everyone. People have got kids and mortgages and all of that sort of stuff. But
yeah.
trialing something on the side is not the same as being in the business all the time and giving you 100%.
Yeah. It is a tricky one because anyone who's got kids or try to change careers or whatever it might be understands the
That's
difficulties
right.
of doing that, right? And
Right. And
it's
I
no
think,
different to being in a professional services firm and starting your own firm. Like there's
yeah,
always those tricky elements of when
yeah.
you go all in and how do you do it?
Well, that's the thing, it's a timing thing, and also you've got most of the time you do have to start it on the side, that's fine, and there's just a point where you've got to make a decision, are you gonna really do it or not do
Yeah.
it? And I think to get funding, I think it'd be really hard to get funding to say, "I've got this job I'm gonna keep and I'm doing this." Why would anyone invest in someone who's got the 2? So I suppose, but as I said, I don't wanna stop anyone starting ideas and working on them while they're in other jobs because I think that's sort of the nature of it at the beginning as well.
Are Australian investors and founders intense enough? You
Can
talk about hustle, the difference in hustle between the US and Australia. Is there a level of intensity that the same as the US?
I would say my observation was that there is an absolute ferocious intensity in the US and
Yeah.
especially in San Francisco. And, I went back and forth there probably every month for 8 years. And it never failed to amaze me. And I think just the level of competition there is just fueling this, real hyper focus on what people are doing. And because people will generally help other people, it's how many people can I get in front of? How many people can you introduce me to? And I don't feel that that's here as much. I think people will connect you, and we certainly do that. And people have been very generous to me, but it's not the same. But I don't have founders coming to me saying, give me 3 names now. And it's sort of
Yeah.
like, it does feel a little softer, I would say, in
Yeah.
that intensity, but I wouldn't say the intensity is all great too. Sometimes it's a bit much when you're
Oh,
over there.
100%.
Like,
Yeah, yeah. No, no. But it also depends on the outcomes, and not everyone has to be like that, of course, and that's different cultures. I kind of find it interesting that when you've got the US in sort of the way it is, and in Australia, my own observation is that there's an element of not lifestyle business, that's the wrong way to look at it. The industry is more relaxed than what you probably need to succeed on a global level.
yeah, I think the observations are all valid. I mean, wherever you sit, I mean, it's not that they don't work hard. It's just, maybe it is a cultural thing. I mean, sometimes I remember when I came back and going into a Stone and Chalk or some of those places, and it would be empty at 5:30. And I just,
Yeah.
you go in the US, and we were in co-working space a lot, and it's definitely, that place is pumping at 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah,
And
right. Yeah, yeah.
again, I'm not saying Australians don't work hard or anything like that, but again, it was just a different cultural expectation, I think,
Yeah.
around that sort of thing, where I think here the lifestyle business thing is interesting 'cause, people have a bad connotation of it. But one of the things we do see is a lot of businesses, and maybe they're not sort of startups, but they're technology, but they've got a great business, like great, and they're
Mm,
doing really well in Australia. And then they come in and they say, I want to go overseas. And the conversation I have with them is really around, you could lose it. You've got kids in private schools, you've got
Yeah.
a boat, you've got a great house, and there's those sorts of things to talk through it as well. I mean, my point being, sometimes a lifestyle business is a great business. You can be
Yeah.
a startup and just be here. The global piece is unbelievably hard. It is a piece that I used to sort of more work with companies that were going over to the US, and that was 10 years ago. And I don't know whether our thinking has evolved much or our success rates in that time. It's still a really hard thing for us to do well.
Yeah.
And we touched on it before, the different cultures, and we all understand how difficult the US is and everything, but I don't think we really understand how hard it is to build
Yeah.
a new business and to fund. You have to fund it all out of this business, that business. So that's, it's pretty hard once you get comfortable here as well to go and do all of that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, a few quick ones to finish off with. Who's a business person that inspires you the most and why? You can have a couple if you want.
Yeah, I think about this. I was asked this the other day actually for someone, and actually feel like we get to see that many founders and people. You get to see so many little things from these people that are so extraordinary that I sort of hesitate to go, there's one, one person that sort of fulfills that. Because I think that the people that impress me is, as I said, the clarity, the speed, the urgency they have, the vision that they have, and the execution against that you can see that they've got. To me, that's like when you see that, as I mentioned before, it sort of blows you away. It's like
Yeah.
that's what I think. I'm like, that's what I want to be. I want to be like that when I grow
Yeah.
up.
Yeah. So you've just avoided the question and not given me a name. And I'm not going to let that happen. You've got to give me at least someone that comes to mind that is that inspires you. Could be anywhere in the world.
Yeah, I mean, look, I hate saying, because again, it just sounds so boring, but I mean, what does everyone want to be? Melanie Perkins? Doesn't everyone want to be what she's done? I remember, this is going to be one of those stories, but there was a thing called OzApps, which used to be held in Perth. It's now West Tech Fest. And one of those was, I can't, maybe 10 years ago or something. And I think Larry Lopez in Perth, which people would know if they're in startups, he sort of organized it. And I remember seeing Melanie and Cliff pitch. They sat together. I remember they were holding hands. No one really knew what they were, and they were pitching Canva. And like, I still remember she had something. She was so nervous. I remember her hands were shaking, and seeing that. And over those years, especially in the early years, had more to do with her. I haven't for a long time now. And I mean, again, she's just so focused, and it's such an extraordinary story. So I think
It's an incredible story.
it is. And her focus on product. And I've had people that I know really well that have been in there working with her on product, and they just say she is like next level, just thinking so far ahead. And I think
Yeah.
that's so inspirational. I think for young females, we're trying to get more females into the space. And I think holding up people like Melanie is awesome.
Yeah. No, 100%. What about business books that you've read? Any that stand out?
Yeah, I like to read all of them. I don't know. I like the one I think I love the best is the Hard Things About Hard Things. We use that. We talk
Yeah.
about that a lot in here. But again, the business books, I like the first bits. Where's that app and it just gives you the summary of most of the business books? I think it's really
Yeah.
good. It's like, I don't know. I mean, I feel like I read all of them, but I think that one's actually, if you're going to get into startups, I think that is the best because it just shows how many times he had to pivot and change and the ups and downs of it and everything. It's sort of an extraordinary story. To me, that's great.
You almost sound a little bit bored by some of those books that you've read as
Um,
you say that.
I think I've read too many. Like, I really
Yeah.
think
Okay.
I've actually overdone it. And I really like podcasts. Like, I listen to a lot of podcasts. So I think to
Yeah.
me, that's really it has actually replaced probably the need to go and read a lot of these books
Yeah.
because I'd rather go and find the author and then find podcasts where they're interviewed on
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and get into a couple of those because I think that you can drill down from different angles and understand it. So I like doing that. But yeah, podcasts to me are sort of the only problem with podcasts is now you feel guilty if you're not listening to it the whole time. Like you're bettering
Yeah.
yourself,
Right.
improving yourself.
No, that's true. I've always found books like, and I think you're right. I think there's an element of you can read X amount of books, but after a while, you have to just get on with building and doing rather than reading, right? But
Yeah.
I always find books around business and the founders themselves interesting. So, like the Everything Store
Yeah.
around
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Amazon story, I found that really fascinating. Some of those types of books where they're not necessarily saying about this is how you do business or whatever it might be, but some of the stories around that, because there's always something that gives you a greater understanding about the business model and the vision and the thinking. And I've always find that fascinating because every story is unique, right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's really interesting actually because it is unique, and yet the more you work with a number of startups, I feel like I'm starting to see pattern recognition in certain things. We're actually trying to explore if that is actually true. Is there sort of pieces of the journey that we could actually not write a playbook for, but actually help founders sort of think through, so they're not having to face this on their own each time and think it is unique, because there's this sort of
Yeah.
isn't. But I love the founder stories actually, and I'm with you on that. I think hearing how individuals face different problems around whether it's revenue or this or that or whatever is interesting. I think Innovation Bay does a really good podcast when I think they've interviewed all the key founders, really all continue to do so. And I
Yeah.
love those. I think they're great.
Yeah. What's next for the Australian tech scene and what you guys are doing?
For the tech scene, I hope it just keeps growing and growing. We've got to get some funding happening again. That would be good. So hopefully that's going to pick up again, which, yeah, will really start to fuel things, which I think at the moment, I think the last 12 to 18 months in some ways has been not a bad thing, in that businesses have definitely had to start focusing on sort of the fundamentals and getting things right, and building very viable businesses. But I think now we just need some funding to come back in to start to grow that. And for us, I'm sort of as I touched on before, I'm interested in what we can do around this international piece. I think there's probably some programs we could develop around helping founders think about why they're going, when are they going, where are they going initially, and then I think actually sort of helping in that next stage of how do they really start to flesh out their business plans. I think we're seeing there's a real sort of, that's a bit of a black hole for a lot of companies, and certainly a lot of companies going out before they should. So we're thinking about that. I think the other side is what's really interesting is what's going to happen with a lot of our offerings. Like imagine if we could have a sort of a suite of offerings that is all more digital or automated, and that
Yeah.
would be around like R&D. What if we could automate the R&D process and write those, the government grants? What if it was
Yeah.
more automated around finance function? That would lower the price, make all of that more accessible. And they're the things that founders just have to have. So sort of, I'm interested to see where we go with that. We're sort of trying to push it from within. So I think those sorts of things are interesting. But the focus for us is just keep growing the business, working with more startups. But the international piece is the piece I think's the interesting bit.
Okay. Very interesting. Amanda, thanks for joining us on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.